irrespective of whether there's a God, what is it that you fear we would lose if people stopped believing that there was a God?
We'd lose the metaphoric substrate of our ethos, and we'd be lost.
So I really want to know, and I'm not being a dick. I want to know what you mean when you say metaphorical substrate. I'm probably just monumentally ignorant, but I really don't think I have a good understanding of what you mean.
Well, there's levels of thought. I mean, every thought structure, let's say, every belief structure is multi-leveled, like a piece of music. And there's the word in a phrase, and then there's the phrase, and then there's the sentence, and then there's the paragraph, and then there's the sequence of paragraphs within which the paragraphs are uttered. And then there's a broader context of interpretation within which all of that is interpreted. And then there's our emotional and motivational similarity. And then there's our embodiment in the world. And all of those things are operative at all times when we're understanding one another. And as you move outside the realm of the linguistic, like the paragraph level, let's say, into the realm of the emotional and motivational and embodiment and embodied, you also move into the metaphorical. And the metaphorical is structured in a particular way. And so at the bottom of a linguistic structure, there's something that's extra linguistic. And it tends to take form in metaphor and narrative and drama and that sort of thing. And the religious landscape is the narrative, metaphor, drama landscape. And if you disrupt it, then you blow apart the widest possible context within which the specific utterances are rendered comprehensible.
Okay, so I followed all that, shockingly.
If you didn't follow that all the way, that's okay. I'm going to show you a number of clips of Jordan Peterson and other experts like John Vervaeke, George Lakoff, and Jonathan Haidt. And I'm going to explain how this concept of the metaphorical substrate is not just word salad, but a very sophisticated psychological concept that doubles as an extremely useful political tool for anyone interested in affecting political change and also understanding what the hell is going on in Western society today. So with all that in mind, let's jump right into Jordan Peterson's first key point.
Well, there's levels of thought. I mean, every thought structure, let's say, every belief structure is multi-leveled, like a piece of music.
In order to explain this idea, I'm going to divert to the P.F. Jungian semi-Freudian model of the mind, which I just made up, but I think is very useful. So if we think of the mind as having levels of thought, at the top of mind, no pun intended, is the conscious mind. This is the domain of attention. So you're focused on the pyramid or the words or whatever your attention is focused on. That is the domain of the conscious mind. Now, we're capable of covert attention, so you could be eating something and watching this video, or driving and listening to something. That's covert attention. It's still part of the conscious mind, but at a lower level. Then there is the preconscious mind. So this is cognitive content that can be made conscious through memory retrieval. So if I ask you, what is your mother's first name? You would pull from the preconscious mind and enter the conscious attention span. The preconscious mind is the domain of information that was once conscious but has been pushed underneath and can be called up, again, through memory. And then beneath the preconscious mind is the infinitely vast unconscious mind, which contains all of your processing for your autonomic nervous system, regulating your emotions, your heartbeat, all of that. Now, at all times, all levels of that pyramid are operating from moment to moment at the same time and in congruence with each other. And conscious information can be fed into the unconscious and vice versa. So if you're starving or hungry, your conscious mind will think of food or think of ideas of how to get food. And if you read a tweet about, let's say, Donald Trump, let's say you get 1,000 of those tweets, all of those will start in the conscious mind, but the only thing that will remain, because you can't remember every single tweet you've seen, all that you unconsciously remember, so to speak, is the emotional reaction you had toward that tweet. And this is why everyone hates each other, because they can't really articulate I can't articulate all of the times I've seen images and videos of like the alt-right and Antifa, whom I despise, doing all their stupid shit, but I've seen it enough where I can just unconsciously react to Antifa and alt-right as morons, which they are, and I can't think of every tweet that, reminded me of that, but they definitely existed. So obviously this is not a perfect model of the mind, but it is useful in understanding the next part of Jordan Peterson's statement.
There's the word in a phrase, and then there's the phrase, and then there's the sentence, and then there's the paragraph, and then there's the sequence of paragraphs within which the paragraphs are uttered, and then there's a broader context of interpretation within which all of that is interpreted, and then there's our emotional and motivational similarity, and then there's our embodiment in the world. And all of those things are operative at all times when we're understanding one another. And as you move outside the realm of the linguistic, like the paragraph level, let's say, into the realm of the emotional and motivational and embodiment and embodied, you also move into the metaphorical. And the metaphorical is structured in a particular way.
Now, to quote Anakin Skywalker, this is where the fun begins, because the concept of metaphor is extremely important and exciting. Metaphor is not just a literary term that you learn in language arts class, which is what happened with me. The concept and the capacity for metaphor is literally what all speech, what all cognition, conscious cognition, is built upon. And I do mean that neurophysiologically, as I'm going to show you. Metaphors are the neural circuits that connect, literally connect, the different parts of our brain that operate at the same time.
If you look at a brain scan of somebody who's having a psychedelic experience, areas of the brain that normally do not talk to each other are talking to each other now. Now, if I was just to do that to you, if I was just to get areas to talk to each other, you'd experience that as noise. But if you've got enhanced insight and enhanced intuition, those areas are now talking to each other and you can bridge between them. You can connect them. And now this is an ability you take for granted. You think it is just the normal part of your cognition. This is your capacity for metaphor. The word metaphor is itself a metaphor. It means to bridge, to carry over, to connect things that are normally not connected. And what you need to understand is how pervasive metaphor is. But I want you to reflect now, and notice the word reflect is a metaphor, on how your thought and language is filled with metaphor. By the way, that was a metaphor. I'll say, for example, do you see what I'm saying? Do you get my point? Do you comprehend it? Can you grasp it? Do you understand it? These are all metaphors. It's pervasive and profound. All of your cognition, this is work done by Lakoff and others. I have some criticisms of some of their theory, but the idea that your cognition is filled and functions through metaphorical enhancement, that's just, I think, the case.
Now, that's sort of complicated, so I'm going to have George Lakoff explain the concept of metaphor from a different perspective, a more neurological perspective, in which he explains how, again, metaphors are the neural circuits that connect different frames in the brain. So a cognitive frame is essentially a concept you have built into your mind as a result of experience.
Every word in every language is defined relative to a frame. That if you take a word like waiter or menu or dish or something like that, you're going to evoke a restaurant frame. But this restaurant frame, which you all have, by the way, how many frames do you have in your head? Tens of thousands. Lots. Anytime you have any institution or situation that is conventional, that you know about, you have a frame for it. You know what the elements are, you know what happens in it, and you know what doesn't happen in it. And then you have a huge numbers of metaphors. So what's a metaphor? Metaphor is a map from frame to frame or schema to schema. And what you're learning as they both active, you get spreading activation that goes through the rest of the brain, finds the shortest circuit between them, and that forms a circuit. That circuit is the metaphor. So again, I pour more water in the glass, the level goes up every time, more is up, less is down, and we have a metaphor, more is up, less is down, prices rise or fall. They apply to prices, they apply to temperatures. The heat went up, turn the heat down, and so on.
So one way to think about the metaphorical substrate is the bedrock of neural circuitry that we use to connect different conscious cognitive frames. So temperature, which is an objective phenomenon, and prices, which are socially constructed phenomenon, can both be explained in the same language by using this underlying bedrock of neural circuitry that is the metaphorical substrate. And in just a moment, you'll see how this neural circuitry is directly related to behaviors that evolved over millions of years and that we share with other animals. But first, I have to explain what Jordan Peterson means when he says,
and the metaphorical is structured in a particular way.
And this is going to take all of my intelligence to try and explain, which is not going to be enough, so I'm going to try my best, and we'll see how it goes. Just as the objective world of matter and all the physical reality around us can be broken down into three fundamental elements, protons, neutrons, and electrons, the entire domain of human experience and subjective experience can be broken down into another three fundamental elements. And I'll let Jordan Peterson explain what they are.
We're social cognitive primates, and that our fundamental cognitive categories, a priori cognitive categories, are It's masculine, feminine, and child. It's something like that. That's the fundamental structure of reality, because we're social creatures and we view reality as something that's essentially social in its nature. And then when we started to conceptualize reality outside the social world, which wasn't very long ago, by the way, and which is something that animals virtually don't do at all, we use those a priori social categories as filters through which we interpreted the external world.
And so these three a priori cognitive frames are the fundamental frames that the metaphorical substrate is built around, and that gives rise to all aspects of human culture, religion, narrative, all of that. If you think about some of the more complex representations, metaphors, symbols that exist in human culture, things like the idea of a motherland or a fatherland or a home country, things that people have fought over, and died over at rates of tens of millions of people. These metaphorical categories, these symbolic representations, are not just the constructs of a human mind that developed as a secondary consequence of consciousness. They are representations and extensions of unconscious behaviors that are being translated through these a priori sociocognitive categories of masculine, feminine, and child. And thus we can see how human culture, including religious rituals and national identity, all of which is built on a metaphorical substrate that mediates between the unconscious and conscious mind and connects parts of the brain through neural circuitry. All of that is so real and embodied in our behavior, going back millions of years in our evolutionary past, that we can see echoes of that in animals as distant to us as elephants.
If you hold something sacred, then your team circles around it, and it's only those who circle around with you, and sometimes literally circle around, like Muslims at prayer in Mecca, they literally circle the Kaaba. Circling is a very primitive, ancient, it feels right to circle. But even if you do it symbolically, or you all bow at the same time, that binds you together.
Children do that with their mothers when they engage in exploratory behavior, right? Well, they use their mother as a center of the world, and children differ in the degree to which they'll move outward from their mother. So they move out until they trip over their uncertainty threshold.
Oh, neat. And is it a distance? Like
it's
you
a
can measure the
distance,
distance?
yeah. And so the more exploratory kids who are lower in negative emotion will go out farther before they come back to their mother. So the mother's a center. And that would be associated symbolically with the idea of the center as a motherland or potentially as a fatherland.
That's right, that makes sense. So this way that we are incredibly symbolic creatures. We're not just out to make as much money as we can. We're symbolic and social creatures.
So now that you understand that the metaphorical substrate is a very real and neurologically grounded phenomenon, this is the most important part of the video where I explain what happens and what is currently happening when people blow out that metaphorical substrate.
And the religious landscape is the narrative, metaphor, drama landscape. And if you disrupt it, then you blow apart the widest possible context within which the specific utterances are rendered comprehensible.
Let me give you an example of what this looks like. In American mythology, so to speak, in American culture, a lot of conservatives hold up Ronald Reagan as an American hero, a culture hero, if you will. He defeated the Soviet Union, he oversaw an economic boom, and whether or not any of that's historically accurate is irrelevant to the fact that that is what is encoded in the metaphorical substrate of conservative Reaganites, or whatever they're called. But if you are, let's say, a gay liberal who was not very happy with how Ronald Reagan handled the AIDS crisis, which killed a lot of people, then you would inhabit a different metaphorical substrate in which Ronald Reagan is not the hero, but the villain. And this would be reflected neurologically, because if I showed each of those two people a picture of Ronald Reagan, their emotional responses to that picture would occur before they're even conscious of what they're looking at, as a consequence of which metaphorical substrate they inhabit. And in today's era, where the political landscape and religious landscape have become indistinguishable, Peterson's claim about being lost without God is directly analogous to a situation where people stop believing in the same political ideals as one another. And so here's the kicker. If I wanted to destroy a country, one way I could do that is ensure that the people of that country are not united in any metaphorical substrate that is common to them. One way to do that would be to attack the mythological figures that most of them hold up, like, for example, the founding fathers of America, and say that, well, John Adams, who, for example, defended the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre, thus archetypically representing the notion of due process even for those people who we regard as our greatest enemies? Well, because he was a slave owner and all of the people he was surrounded by were slave owners, which, by the way, John Adams wasn't even a slave owner, and I didn't know that until after looking it up, but there you go. That ideal is invalidated, thus providing people the rationale to attack lawyers trying to give people the right to due process in America. And tomorrow it will be people claiming that Martin Luther King and that whole idea of treating people equally regardless of race, well, because he was a Southern Baptist minister and didn't have the most progressive views surrounding gay people, that whole idea of treating people on the basis of their content, of their character or whatever, well, that was really just a homophobic sentiment from a homophobic man. And so, and I cannot stress this enough, the number one challenge in the 21st century, politically or otherwise, is not coming up with good policies and good ideas to implement. Those already exist. The challenge is communicating those ideas and messaging them, and the only way that that can be done is first by grounding people in the same shared narrative, putting people in the same metaphorical substrate. And you don't do it with sociological, rational explanations of why this policy is better than this policy. You do it by embodying and acting out the ideals of a cultural narrative that is worth sharing. And to the degree that I do anything on this godforsaken YouTube channel, it is making videos doing essentially just that. And so, with that, as always, good luck and Godspeed.